And hi, I'm Nancy from over at the library, and I've very slowly come to know Sheila through a very couple of different functions, and I just want to say that she's our first speaker of the season, and she's an Emmy Award-winning journalist, and she's done investigative journaling on PBS and KATU and Kink Radio, and now she's here for this great book she's written, and I'll let her tell her story. So, Sheila Hamilton.
Wow, I am so happy to be here. When I told people that I was coming out to the Milwaukee Public Library, it was like I was talking about a rock star, like I just said I was going to go see Bono. I didn't realize that this library was so unbelievably supported, and you had such an active community, so congratulations on accomplishing that, because as we well know, it's difficult in this day and age. I want to just tell you the history of how I came to write this book. When my late husband was hospitalized in the fall of 2006. I went to my local bookstore, which is the one I always buy my books at, Pals, and I looked for a book that could help caregivers of people with mental illness. And I was really shocked that there are so many books about mental illness that are written by psychiatrists and by psychologists and even by people who are experiencing mental illness themselves, but very few books are written for caregivers, the people who actually take the bulk of the responsibility of care. And I found that what I was really hoping for was someone to walk me through the chaos that I was feeling in attempting to understand an illness that I knew next to nothing about. And Toni Morrison has this wonderful quote that says, if there's a book you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, you must write it. And so that's what I did. All the things we never knew. It's part memoir and it's part reporting on everything that I learned in the wake of my husband's illness and his eventual death. I missed so much of the unfolding of David's illness. By the time that I actually pieced together the puzzle of who he was falling apart. He was brilliant. He was a designer builder, a wonderful and warm father to our daughter, and absolutely gorgeous. The ladies loved him, as I did when I first saw him, 6'5" and beautiful brown hair and electric blue eyes. And he had an energy that just completely captivated the room. But David suffered from the soul-eating emotion of shame. He was born with a cleft palate, and he underwent numerous surgeries as a toddler to have it fixed. And by the time I met him, he had just a tiny scar above his lip to show for those surgeries. But older boys had teased him, and it got so bad that by the time he was 9, his parents sent him away to England to a boarding school to attempt to try to alleviate the bullying. In fact, it got so much worse, and he said that he often felt so alone and so completely depressed as a 9-year-old child. We know now that trauma is at the root of most mental illness, and David certainly had his fair share. He also shared a genetic predisposition to bipolar disorder, which was never ever discussed with me. David's doctor said that he compensated for that illness because he was so brilliant for almost 25 years. But the more that David felt the symptoms of his depression, the stronger his shame. And it prevented him from ever really acknowledging his worsening health, because shame repeats this very convincing story to us about how we're not acceptable as we are, and that to belong and to be lovable, we need to be different than we are. And as long as David stayed locked up in that shame, I couldn't help him. If he had allowed himself to be, even for a day or a week or a month, more vulnerable, we might have been able to actually work through our problems. I think David might have been able to see himself as that panicked toddler going back to the emergency room, or maybe the 9-year-old who was an ocean away and feeling his first depression. Brené Brown says shame grows in secrecy, silence, and judgment, and only empathy is the antidote. And that's one of the things that I've really learned about mental illness, is believing in yourself enough to be able to believe that you can recover. And the only way that you can do that is by having people around you who also believe in your ability to recover. The behavioral components of mental illness take an enormous toll on the family members of sufferers. And David's impaired awareness of his illness actually compounded our problems. He denied anything was wrong, and he shifted the blame, and he said that I was the person who needed help. And the medical term for this is anosognosia, and more than half of people with mental illness actually have this kind of frontal lobe disorder. So when David first cheated on me early in our marriage, I didn't put it in the category of the actions of a mentally ill person. Instead, I just thought he was being cruel and selfish. And I now understand that hypersexuality is just a very common hallmark of bipolar disorder. And when David cycled through these periods of depression, I chalked it up to just his extreme sensitivity and his brilliance. I thought that maybe he needed more downtime than most people. But toward the end of his illness, David began to exhibit extreme anxiety. He was pacing. He was forgetting to turn off his truck. He would refuse to eat anything that I'd cooked and instead started eating the same thing night after night after night. And then David suffered even more trauma. His business was in trouble, and his father, whom David had a very difficult relationship with, was dying. I learned of yet another affair. In those weeks, David's agitation grew exponentially. And when people ask me when I actually really realized he was sick, it was this late in our marriage, this late in his illness, in the fall of 2006. He stopped sleeping. He became explosive, impulsive. He stopped caring for his appearance. He saw a well-meaning friend who was a physician, and that well-meaning friend prescribed him antidepressants. I'm going to read from page 87 in All the Things We Never Knew. 90 degrees, suffocating by Portland standards. Star, our yellow lab, panted heavily, leaving drool marks on the hardwood floors. Max, a West Highland, napped nearby. The sun shone brightly through floor-to-ceiling windows. The pool looked cool and blue. But there were dishes to load, a house to clean, and dogs to feed, and Sophie needed a ride to summer camp before I headed off to work. I was mad at David for refusing to get air conditioning. The linen suit I wore had sweat stains under the arms. I'd begun looking for apartments, and I was saving up the down payment for a house. I had an appointment with a divorce lawyer, but I hadn't said a word about these plans to David. As much as I wanted to leave him, I also didn't want to be responsible for destroying his life. He seemed so fragile, as if one line might suck the last of his life out of him. In a strange turn of events, David's frailty now held our marriage together. David stood near me while I loaded the dishwasher. He stared out at the weeds in the garden where he and Sophie had excitedly planned to grow huge, monstrous tomatoes and corn. Dried clods of dirt covered the spots where she'd carefully planted her seeds. David's big hands seemed to be the only thing holding him up. He leaned against the granite kitchen countertop, putting what was left of his weight on his hands. In the few weeks since he'd been hospitalized, he seemed to be vanishing. I guess he'd lost 15 pounds. His green boxer shorts hung limp and low around his hips. He slumped from the weight of being alive. His beard was an unkempt inch of scraggly hair. He stank of alcohol and something that reminded me of dental fillings. Ever since he started those antidepressants, the stench of metal seeped through his pores. After being hospitalized, David had talked to a friend of his who was a primary care doctor into giving him the meds. When I'd asked the doctor's name or where the office was or if I could come to the appointment, David refused to give me the information. The whole thing seemed so dangerous and unprofessional. But I also hoped the meds might stabilize him. At night, he said he lay awake, sweating. I changed his sheets daily, trying to keep the stink from sinking into the walls. His ribs showed through his skin, and he seemed not to care when his boxer slipped down his waist. Sophie had actually been the one to pick those shorts out, guessing that he would love the color, green, and the red pheasants flying up toward the waistband. David used to love watching birds in flight. She'd used her allowance to buy the boxers, then stuff them in a red stocking along with a plastic bag of gummy bears. I love them, David had said excitedly, pulling the boxers on over his jeans and doing a dance that had made Sophie laugh. David spoke slowly, quietly. I heard voices last night. What do you mean? I said. I didn't look up. I tried to focus on getting the dishes done before work. anything to calm the chaos. There was 15 minutes left to get the house clean, drop our daughter at summer camp, and get to work. I put another dish in the dishwasher. Rinse, load, repeat. Last night, I heard voices telling me to jump off the bridge, he said in a monotone. He was no more dramatic than if he were talking about how much it cost to fill up his truck with gas. I heard it as plain as day. Jump from the vista. Although SSRIs have been used successfully to treat millions of people, they can be disastrous for people with bipolar disorder. In the National Institute of Mental Health's most recent study that they did on this, more than half of people with bipolar disorder who were given antidepressants for the first time were pushed over into their first manic phase. In ancient Greek, the word akathisia means the inability to sit still. But David described what happened to him as being possessed by a chaotic demonic force. He stopped sleeping from that point on. He said that he itched constantly. He said he felt an irritability with himself that he couldn't imagine, that he couldn't stand himself and the decisions that he'd made in his life. In July of 2009, 3 years after David's death, the Journal of Psychopharmacology finally reported that Prozac and other SSRIs can, in fact, induce akathisia along with suicidality. Many people never recover, and David did not. He made his second suicide attempt the day before he was hospitalized. He was hospitalized for 6 weeks, and then he ended up going missing the day after his release. I'm going to read again from page... Sorry. Huh. Here we go. Sorry about that. The police search and rescue squad had gone back to the mountains several times after its initial search and covered hundreds more miles with Boy Scouts and dogs. Now the snow was coming, and the department's surge budget was dry. Maybe they could search again come spring. David's sisters left the house one by one. Jill passed her nursing exam and would begin working soon. Adele needed to return home to deal with her own divorce and her own patients. My sister and mother flew home, promising they'd check in on us. One of the most startling things to deal with in the aftermath of trauma is how quickly the rest of the world moves on. The tow truck driver needed to be paid. The bank called due David's loan. My cell phone stopped working due to an unpaid bill. I was in the worst kind of limbo, one in which David had simply vanished, leaving me to tie up millions of his loose ends. I was struck during this in-between time how Sophie instinctively wanted to re-engage with the people and activities that were present. She refused to be stuck in limbo, moving, as my therapist said, like a tree in a windstorm. This was our big storm together, and the only thing that could soften the pain and the process for her was love and a return to the familiar. I went back to work, desperate for something I knew. In my office, I pulled out a legal pad from my file and made a crude list of priorities. It read, Sophie's emotional well-being, therapist, ? Buy a phone card, go to DMV, David's car, hire an accountant, call the mortgage company, call the utilities, and meet with an investment advisor. By the time I'd finished, I had 30 items that needed to be taken care of immediately. I got started. Snow fell hard and heavy in November. From time to time, I would talk to the officer from Clackamas County who'd run the search for David, and she'd give me an update. More than a foot of snow in the gorge, she'd say, then 2 feet, and then 3. Normally, Portland doesn't get much snow. It was one of the heaviest winters we'd had in decades. One evening, I awoke from a night terror, my heart beating wildly and sweat covering my body. I dreamed of David, lost in the wilderness, barefoot, looking for his Columbia jacket. My pillow was drenched with tears. I knew then we would find his body. It was supposed to snow the day. I told Sophie I would prepare her favorite meal of crab cakes and risotto for her and our friends the Wilsons. We'd planned the meal at Colin's home since I hadn't even begun to decorate for Christmas. Sophie helped smash the crab and mush the cornmeal. We stirred rice and assembled crackers and cheese on huge plates. After dinner, we made a fire in Colin's living room, and Sophie snuggled next to me on the couch. Maddie sat on the other side of the room with her parents, and her sister Gemma was lounging on a long chaise. Colin, who'd been washing dishes, stepped into the room, the color drained from his face. "What is it?" I said. "What's happened?" Colin motioned me to come to the phone. "Take this," he said. "It's important." When we were out of Sophie's earshot, Colin put the phone to his chest and said, "They found him." I felt my body collapse against Colin's, the weight of the months falling in on me. He held my arm as I stumbled to his study. Not now, I thought. Sophie is so happy tonight. I raised the phone and a man spoke. "Ms. Hamilton?" "Yes," I whispered. "We had a volunteer search team on the mountain tonight. It seems like we've been over that place 1,000 times before." I was half hearing his words. The voice seemed distant, distorted, too slow, like a tape played at a quarter speed. It felt like it was pulling me down into quicksand. "We started back at the house and did a grid search again," the voice said. "And this is very hard to tell you, Miss Hamilton, but we found David." My fingers loosened around the phone. I was going to drop to my knees. I held on, forcing myself to listen, forcing the reality that I'd known for so many weeks to crash down on me. "I'm very sorry," he said. Where was he? I don't know how I formed those words. A tremor ran through my body. My legs and arms began to shake. Colin's study was the old Episcopal church office, cold tile and a high ceiling. The windows were frosted. I could feel my body freezing from the inside. Colin stood by me, rubbing my back. The blood stopped pumping to my extremities. My fingers felt white, frostbitten. The voice continued. "He was about 500 yards north of the house, ma'am, in a heavily wooded area. I don't know how we missed it before. One of my officers said he'd sworn he'd walked through that exact spot a dozen times before. But there he was, sitting right up against a tree, with his legs crossed." I wanted to stop him, to say, please slow down. It's too much all at once. But this was his trauma too now, a total stranger and I, bound by a senseless death. I thought I was ready for this call, that 6 weeks had prepared me for the inevitable. I was not. "And can I tell you something?" the officer said. "I've come across a lot of suicides in this territory. For some reason, this is a place people come to when they want it over. But this was different. He looked so calm, peaceful. Really, I'm not just saying that, ma'am. He looked like he was at peace. He was looking out at a valley, and he looked like he'd sat there a long time." My fingers went limp around the phone. The will that had held me up during that conversation was gone. I could not hear any more. I could not manage the details of how he died by suicide, or why the dogs missed a man's frozen body 500 yards from where the search began. I could not ask him all the questions the reporter in me would have asked. What was the caliber of the gun? Was his body decomposed? Was there any sign of foul play? I whispered thank you and asked Colin to take the phone. I didn't want to hear what it was I was supposed to do next, where they would take his body, and what kind of responsibility I had to the police department, or the coroner, or the dozens of people who aided in the search. I watched myself walk back into the living room where Sophie and Maddie's family were talking in low, worried tones, and I watched myself sit down next to Sophie, grabbing her small hands to make sure she wouldn't run screaming into the night. She looked closely at my face, and her eyes widened. Her slender legs were covered with tights that were the color of the snow. Her long blonde hair was pulled back with a red ribbon. I noticed this because David loved her hair that way, out of her face, away from her pretty eyes, and her lips that looked like a heart. She moved her face closer to mine, and she tightened her grip on my hands until the blood left them. I spoke slowly, so I would not babble, so I would not make her more fearful than she already was. The hardest part was hers to bear now. I tried to calm the tremor moving through my body so that I could tell her correctly, tell her the unthinkable. "Remember when I told you it would be better if we knew, one way or the other, what happened to Daddy? Her face tightened, her eyes becoming wildly alert, as if she might bolt from my grasp, away from me. She interrupted, already knowing, already crushed. "What, Mama? What?" They were the most dreaded words of my lifetime, and I knew I had no choice but to tell the truth. "They found him, honey, and he's dead." "I'm so sorry." I put my arms around her, holding her deep in my chest, trying desperately to cushion this blow. Her body fell into mine, a moment I knew I would have to replay again and again in my lifetime, a memory seared into my brain, deeper than the deepest grief I knew. The shuttle exploding, the Twin Towers falling, all of the images of innocence lost I had ever seen, and now this, too. Sophie held my waist, her face buried in my chest. I had never heard a child's heart breaking. It is a sound so unforgiving, I knew I would never stop hearing it. It would ring through my memory at exactly the same pitch, with the same intensity, reminding me of the crippling of her heart. The deep, grieving wail she let out echoed through the home, into the street, interrupting the silence of the falling snow. I held her. Kay Redfield Jamison was very helpful to me in understanding suicide, understanding bipolar disorder, understanding mental illness. She's a brilliant neurologist who is also bipolar, and she's written several wonderful books. She says in her book, each suicide is intensely private, unknowable. Terrible suicide will have seemed to the perpetrator the last and the best of bad possibilities, and any attempt by the living to chart this final terrain of life can be only a sketch, maddeningly incomplete. And yet I couldn't let go of the question of why. I couldn't let go of my failure to recognize and to intervene and to effectively help treat my husband's worsening condition. So I went to work as a reporter, and here's what I learned. 9 years ago, we just didn't have the understanding that trauma is at the root of most mental illness, and our hospitals were set up as acute care centers with impersonal and overly rigid view of patients and their problems. And the bulletproof glass that surrounded David seemed to embody the very nature of that problem. Here, David was suffering, needing kindness, and he was thrown into a system that was bureaucratic, impersonal, lacking in empathy and creativity. The nurses didn't know his name, and the doctor there saw him only for medication checks. It was one drug upon the other. If we don't stop re-traumatizing the people who are actually getting mental health services, our rate of suicide is undoubtedly going to continue to climb. 50% of the people who die by suicide have actually seen their primary care doctor and are under treatment. 30% are actually actively under the care of their psychiatrist. I believe that we've relied for way too long on a pharmaceutical-only approach to mental illness that fails to take in the whole person, the body, the mind, and the spirit. And I've often said a more helpful response to David's traumas could have been an accountant to help him work out his business, a grief counselor to help him actually work out things with his father before he died, and a spiritual advisor to help David find his way back to his heart. If I had to do it over again, I'd attempt in-home recovery with the oversight of a medical provider who actually believes in medication as a screwdriver, not as a jackhammer. And I am so thrilled that Oregon is actually changing the way it delivers care to our people with mental illness. The Unity Behavioral Care Center is going to be one of the first in the country with a compassionate care model where users and patients will help shape their own recovery plan. This is a huge collaboration with Legacy Good Sam and Adventist, Oregon Health Science, and Kaiser Permanente, and it's going to house teenagers and adults and provide swift, patient-centered care. I couldn't have hoped for a better outcome to what I perceived as a failure of care. And in the aftermath of David's death, it took a long time for me to stabilize our family's financial future and the emotional current of our lives. But once I came to terms with what actually killed David, I did an enormous amount of research to learn more about what we can do to be more compassionate to people with brain disorders. I really believe that if we began modification at the earliest ages and offered early intervention for the most at risk, we could prevent another loss of life as exquisite as David's. Early intervention programs like ESA here in Oregon are proving that the most important factors in preventing onset are teaching coping skills like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and leaning on a community of friends and family who believe in your ability to rejoin your community, your school, and your work. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has described the 5 stages of grief as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But when a loved one commits suicide, the list is so incomplete because the question always haunts us is why? What could I have done differently? It's an unnatural choice, and it leaves carnage for the living. But I'd propose one more stage of grief to this list. In the case of suicide, one that really helped me, it was forgiveness. It wasn't until I reached the stage of forgiveness that I was able to sort out my failings from those of my husband. In accepting responsibility for my part in David's death, I was finally able to understand his sense of futility and his unwillingness to face his illness any longer. I forgave him. And in doing so, I've been much better able to understand his decision. And my hope is that our story, told from the other side of this 6th stage, is going to be a catalyst for positive change in the way that we approach and regard and respond to the social fallout of mental illness. I come back to a quote when I'm missing my husband so much, when I wish that he could be there to see our beautiful daughter grow up to such an extraordinary human being. And it's look to the living, love them, and hold on. Thank you so much. I would love to take questions because you look like you're an audience that knows your mental health. So does anybody have any questions either about the writing process or about treatment or perhaps an experience that you're going through on your own? Yes?
How's your daughter doing?
She's fantastic. I just got the thrill of a lifetime. I'm probably going to start crying. My daughter was accepted to Stanford University, and yeah, but better than that is that she has become so empathetic around this issue of how do we actually treat well people with mental illness. And she was just chosen to be a research assistant at the Stanford Medical School with a program that's going to combine the very best of computer science with psychiatry. And the places that they're looking at include bipolar disorder to try to avoid the mistake that happened with her father, which was the misdiagnosis. When people come to the hospital, they often are in their most depressed stages because in the manic part, they don't tend to seek out care. They actually really like the energy from the manic stage. And so misdiagnosis is incredibly common. And so they're going to be actually developing a watch similar to this one that people will use that's going to be managing and gauging things like their biorhythms, their sleep patterns, so that the doctor will be able to tell if they're actually in mania or depression. I'm so proud of her, and she practices wellness every single day, which is great. Yes?
I would just like to say a couple things. First, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Oh, you're so welcome. You're so welcome.
And secondly, I so appreciate that you are encouraging a comprehensive approach to wellness that encompasses much more than what we have been taught in our society as being the typical and foundational approach to wellness, utilizing Western care. There are so many other aspects that we can incorporate in incorporating grief counseling and just community involvement and spiritual involvement, whatever that looks like.
Yeah. You know, what's wonderful for me is I'm on the board of the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care. And for the past decade, what we learn about psychiatry and what we learn about the outcomes is mostly funded by drug companies. And our outcomes are actually much worse since this psychopharmaceutical revolution. 250 times more people who are on disability because of mental illness. what we now know is if we can actually fund some of these other activities, like if we can look at some studies that include somatosensory activities like yoga and mindfulness, if we can look at what happens to people when SSRIs are actually compared against cognitive behavioral therapy, we're getting really wonderful outcomes. What we need to do is make sure that these other types of therapies are funded so that we can look at them in a more holistic way. And that's actually happening through the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care. So another great positive thing. It's an international board and an international organization and funded and started here in Wilsonville. So
I was concerned about your crushing debt at the time of his death.
yeah.
How did you cope with that yourself? I mean, it was just unbelievable, the amount of money.
Yeah.
How could you, as a single person, single mother?
Do you know, one of the great things that this taught me was that we have money and then we don't have money, and all that matters is love. I worked so hard in my 20s. I had 2 jobs most of my life and had saved up an awful lot of money to be able to retire when I had this idea I was going to retire when I was 50. And I had managed these apartment complexes and done very well. We sold them at the right time, and I was with another woman, and we had this plan that we were going to go travel the world when we turned 50. We didn't know if we were going to be married. And I essentially put that dream aside and decided I'm going to pay off all the debt at once. I wanted to be done with everything. I wanted not to have the remnants of my daughter thinking about a looming debt over us as we've moved forward. So I used most of the savings that I'd saved, and then I started over. And the miraculous thing about it is that we can do it. And one of the best things about this book is that I've had people call and talk to me about it resonating with different parts of their lives. One woman who'd just gone through a bankruptcy called and said, I can't believe how much better I feel after reading this book, because I've seen you start over, and I've seen you go forward without bitterness or without anger, and I'm going to try to do that same thing. And we're fine. Yeah, hi.
So my best friend of 35 years chose suicide, and it was just last year. Does the guilt ever go away of what did I miss? How could I have helped? Why?
You know, I don't think that it does. I think because it is such an unnatural choice and it's such a mystery to us. I mean, look how hard we try to live, and we try to live healthy every day. So when someone makes that choice, it becomes a never-ending mystery. I felt like that stage that I described, the forgiveness stage, was the best part for me. To say a person who is in that kind of agony is like a person in a burning building who jumps out the window. We must understand it on some level about how much psychic pain they had to be in. And then I'll have other days where I'm like, you jerk.
Oh, yeah.
And that is the ins and the outs of living and loving someone who dies by suicide. That's just what you'll be faced with the rest of your life. And I'm so sorry for your loss. Yes?
What advice would you give a young writer?
Oh, find the story that has to be told. I mean, one of the things that a lot of writers has asked me is, why did you write a book? You're a radio writer, you're a television writer, you're a film writer. But I just wrote this story. I just wrote it down because I had no other choice except to write it down. It's almost as if it moved through me in the 2 years after David died. And then I put it away for a long time to get some objectivity on it. The memoir portion is so subjective, and it's so real time, and it's so grueling that I needed to step away from that and understand actually what I learned. And so if you have a story, a personal story, start there. Start with a story that you feel like really needs to be told, that only you can tell. You look like a very bright young woman. I wish you the best. Yeah.
Like cancer, I'm sure mental illness has many different profiles. What might you offer to people to help their loved ones recognize it, support them, when it doesn't follow one?
They almost never do. It waxes and wanes, and it's very difficult to determine, especially when you're that close to your loved one. Some of the early stuff that I missed, and I really wish I had known what I know now about mental illness, is the agitation and irritability that one might be chalking up to their husband or their wife being a jerk, is a telltale beginning sign of mental illness. It is when there's the inability to concentrate, when they've lost some cognitive function, when you notice things getting really disorganized. That's an early sign of mental illness. And that's when, if we can get the person into treatment, there's still the hope for recovery. By the time David got into treatment, his illness was so bad, and his doctor said it probably shifted from depression to bipolar disorder because he went without treatment for so long. But if we can get in and actually teach them these somatosensory activities and how much they calm the brain and allow for natural healing, it really can be nipped in the bud. ESA, the program that I mentioned, the early intervention program for kids, has cut the early psychosis rate in Oregon in half just by doing this, going into schools, recognizing kids who might have a genetic predisposition, talking with teachers about what they're witnessing, and then providing tons of support and training for these young people. And in just 4 years, we've cut the rate of psychosis in half. That is where we need to nip it, is early on, when you begin to see those strange changes in your loved one's behavior. And we chalk it up to like, well, they're not sleeping, no big deal. It actually is a really big deal when you begin to see those early behaviors.
Is that what Girls Inc. is?
Girls Inc. is an organization that I'm also on the board on that helps especially low-income girls learn values, learn record keeping, and the ability to manage their own finances. It actually helps them with support groups after school so that they have mentors of other women who are professional. And once again, talk about cutting the rate of people that are getting in trouble. Girls Inc. just another wonderful organization because they find the girls in middle school when they're most likely to begin becoming sexually active, when they're most likely to begin hanging out with gangs or hanging out at the mall where there's a large number of people who are actually being taken by these pimps. And they circumvent that process early on. And that's what Girls Inc. is. Yes?
Just by accident, earlier this week, I was listening to an interview on KPOO by a lady who said she had bipolar diagnosis about 14 years old. And I don't remember enough detail other than I think she's written a book about it because she's been off medicine for 2 years to treat bipolar and has done it on her own somehow.
Wow. I haven't. What I know is that it's really tricky to get off the medications after you're on them. You need to do it under the care of a doctor, for sure. But even with schizophrenia, which is, I think most people would agree, one of the most perplexing mental illnesses, the most recent studies is if you can actually provide medication and support during the most acute phase of the psychosis and then wean the people off. In Finland, this is what they've done now for the last 6.5 years, 85% of their people with schizophrenia have returned to work. And it's by teaching them to actually engage with the voices in their heads. There's a wonderful organization called Hearing Voices, which is really working with this, that these antipsychotics actually are shrinking the brain after long-term use, and we need to start weaning people off and give them the tools to deal with the kind of thing that they're coping with. And, you know, I think that if we met again in 10 years, all of us would go, oh, wasn't that strange when we were at that nexus of not understanding if we were going to actually accept holistic care? I actually do think that most mainstream psychiatrists now recognize that they need to change, move away from the heavy, heavy layering of antipsychotics and antidepressants and teach people other skills. Yes?
You referred to sensory somatic and you referred to yoga. Are there specific methods of dealing with sensory somatic?
Somatosensory. It's essentially movement that actually heals the brain. And if you want a wonderful title to read, Dr. Bruce Perry at the Texas Trauma Institute for Children has written a wonderful book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. At the Child Trauma Academy, he deals with the most traumatized children. He deals with kids who've been raised in cages, kids who've seen their parents murdered, the worst cases. And what he does is he allows them to do things like rocking, rhythmic music, yoga, just meditation. He allows them time for this traumatized brain to heal. And then he's working, very sophisticated MRI imaging to actually see what parts of the brain are lighting up. These somatosensory activities are so much more important than we give them credit for. Now, after years of PTSD being such a problem for the federal government, they have now moved to demanding that soldiers who are showing up with PTSD learn meditation and yoga, because these kind of activities slow our brains down and give them the opportunity to heal from trauma. It's groundbreaking. And it's so simple. So simple. Yeah. Yes.
I'm a survivor of mental illness. I didn't try to commit suicide. At one time, I thought of doing something really because I didn't want to inconvenience everybody. And on the other side, we have a shortage of therapists and professionals.
Yeah.
We called so many places to get in,
Yeah.
went to the emergency rooms, and I was told the system is broken down.
Yeah.
I got inappropriate care, therapists, medications, and it's such a challenge. And you are in pain.
Yeah.
not just
No.
mentally.
I completely
Thank you,
understand that.
because I just related everything.
Yeah. I was just at a fundraiser for Ted Wheeler before I came here, and every question to this potential new mayor was about homelessness and mental illness. It is such a pressing problem in our community. And he threw out a statistic that I'd never heard before. $8 billion in mental health funding was removed from the economy from 2008 to 2015. $8 billion. So much of that federal, state, and local money. And so, what I keep coming back to is we're going to have this combination of people like my daughter working on technological advances to make mental health care accessible and easier for people to get. I'd like to see an app where you can actually get a therapist anywhere in the world, have your person on your app to be able to do Skyping with you. That kind of easy access. It doesn't need to be in a psychiatric setting. And then secondly, we must elect people who believe that mental health is a problem and who can actually help refund some of these wonderful programs. Right now, 75% of our inmates at Multnomah County Jail have a mental illness. It's the place they go to get care, to get their medication, and actually be seen. That's a travesty. So I'm with you. I think it's going to be a combination of things, but we really need to refocus on making sure people first get access, and then that the care that they do get is good care, compassionate care. Yes?
Okay, so you wrote this book and then put it away for a couple of years. Then, did you join a writing group? What steps did you take?
I was actually in a writing group before David got very sick, and I was working on another novel about the rodeo circuit because I grew up on the rodeo circuit. And he began getting so sick that I had to quit that writing group. And so when the year of his real serious illness was a year in which I didn't write at all. When he died, it took me 2 years to write the memoir portion. And then after I joined all these mental health boards and started volunteering for all these different organizations, I felt like, this was not just my experience. This is almost everyone's experience. And that's why I felt that the book was probably a wider audience, or had a wider audience than just my own story. And so that's why we made the decision to sandwich the information for people in crisis in between the chapters that are the memoir.
So did you take the book then to a writing group, or did you just get an agent?
No, I just got an agent.
Just got an agent.
Yeah.
Okay, you're ready to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, she's a phenomenal agent. Let me tell you, she also is, after dealing with an agent in New York City, Sandra Bishop, who is local, so believed in the issue of mental health and getting a book on the market that could be accessible for people. She championed this just like she's my princess, she's my warrior princess. Thank you. Yeah.
I was curious what the health insurance, do they support mental health treatments, the non-drug treatments that you've been talking about?
No. The Affordable Care Act has done a really good job of giving more treatment to people, but what it essentially covers right now is the 15-minute med check. And it's very hard to get good coverage for good therapy, lasting coverage. So what I would say is if you can actually work with your insurer to get the most out of the therapy that they do offer, learn the tools, and then get some of the incredible books that are written about cognitive behavioral therapy, about dialectical behavioral therapy, you can continue on some of it, some of the learning journey on your own. But once again, getting back to electing leaders who are actually going to put the funding back in mental health services, I think it's where all of us should be calling our elected officials. Yeah.
What do you see as the next step to remove the stigma from mental health? We're all privy to it here, but at what point do you see it becoming, I'm not making a light, believe me, but of talking about the common cold or the flu
Right.
or anything like that and being able to access help?
I think it's going to be like breast cancer. My mom was telling me there was a time when people wouldn't admit that they had breast cancer, and I was like, there was? And she said, yeah. No?
Yes, you are.
But you don't think it's going to happen with mental health?
Oh, I know it. I'm hoping it will. But what I'm saying is going back to the cancer thing, at 29, I would never have told anyone. I had a tumor in my breast. I didn't want to talk about a breast.
Well, here's where social media is really helping. If you hang out on Twitter or on YouTube or on Facebook with these young advocates, they're doing such incredibly empowering things that I honestly think stigma might die with people over 50. I do. Because we now have access to stories like my own, we have a lot of young stars, football players who are coming forward talking about their mental illness. The more that we all share stories of how unbelievably common, it's 1 in 5 for a serious mental illness. That's a lot of people. And I was just looking at the new statistics for suicide, and they say that for every 1 suicide, there's 25 attempts. Well, last year there was 42,700 suicides. Times that by 25. Times that by the number of people like us who are survivors, who have been left with this legacy of wondering why. And I honestly believe there's a coalition of people who can change things. I do. If I weren't positive about this, if I didn't feel motivated around what's happening with mental health care, I couldn't do these talks because they're grueling. But I think that we're on the right path. I really do.
Can I bug you with one?
Yes.
Substance abuse is a huge part of it.
Yeah.
How do you see that dealing with that as either a self-medication or coping mechanism of some sort, dovetailing into what you want to accomplish?
Well, the great thing is, because there's not as much stigma around substance abuse, they're actually getting more funding. Yesterday, the president announced another $2.5 billion for opioid addictions. And so many of those are just young kids that are treating their mental illness with heroin. And so the great thing is, because now we have these dual diagnosis clinics, what happens is that if we can get them in any kind of care, they actually are doing a good job of saying, oh, I actually think what you might be dealing with is a mental illness, and then hooking them up with a more sophisticated safety net. But getting them into any kind of care is the important thing. I don't know if any of you have had a loved one with substance abuse, but the waiting lists are long. And when someone is finally ready to go get help, it doesn't seem like we should have them waiting 3 and 4 months for a bed. So, yes.
We haven't talked about, but one of the things that's really come up, that as a veteran, I'm upset that the DMV has moved into the hospitals. And I don't know how many people know about atrial fibrillation. You have to go to the toilet. an awful lot of this. It's awful hard to control it. I just got moved, I don't know why. One thing, the people on TV are saying, oh, dementia, all this other stuff, but nobody's coming out with any positive answers, and that's what gets me. They figure out it has something to do with the overuse of how we prepare our food. Now, that's a little more positive than I've heard.
Yeah.
But if you got a car, they'll go after you for your car, regardless of whether you're driving okay or not. And I'm dealing with that and trying to accept this, okay, this has happened to me. But how do you get, there's too many chiefs.
Boy, you said that right.
Somehow in this country we've gone away from all this stuff. Now I did teach this stuff on marijuana and stuff in the Beaverton schools, and hey, all the kids know that, hey, you don't drive if you're using the weed. But we still emphasize using this stuff.
Yeah, you know what? I want to answer that part of your question. I have told my daughter, because she has a genetic predisposition to mental illness, that she can't use drugs. And I think we need to actually be more honest about the number of THC-induced psychoses. There has been a 50% surge in the number of teenagers coming into the hospital rooms in the Portland area because of THC-induced psychosis. So it's almost as if we already have this crisis, and then we go ahead and we legalize the pot, but we refuse to actually talk about, for a certain percentage of teenagers in particular, whose brains are in that vulnerable time between 15 and 25, you can't use drugs. It is, I can't tell you the number of times I've been at a NAMI workshop or at a benefit and sat down next to someone and said, tell me the story of your son or daughter. And they'll say they were brilliant and they went to college and they dropped acid or they did LSD or they did, and they're battling schizophrenia. And they're now 42 and 47. And it just, you know, there is a connection there between the brain doing the very last of its work, laying down the last of its very important connections, and you upsetting it with these substances. And I will admit, every now and then, I like to smoke pot, like every 3 or 4 months. But I didn't do it as a teenager, and I really don't think that we should do it when our brains are developing. I just don't. So, yeah. Yes.
I'm curious to know in what all you've seen and people you've talked to in terms of brain scanning. I think is it Dr. Steve Amon. I think I became aware of it through OPB television. The work he's done with it's the one thing in healthcare that we treat but we can't see.
Right. Yeah, I know. We can see the brain imaging, the colors lighting up on the MRI, but we actually now, where Google, who just probably has put the most funding toward trying to solve the mystery of mental illness, believes that it's actually between the cells. It's the connection and that moment in the messaging between the cells. And you don't see that, right? And that's one of the huge mysteries around antidepressants is they work for some people, but we didn't know why they worked. It was kind of like, putting radiator oil all over your engine, and some of it gets in and works, but we're not exactly sure how or why or how much is good or how much is right. And so I think as they get closer, think about it. 10 years ago, we didn't have MRI imaging. We wouldn't have been able to see what they see now, like with deep depression, there are parts of the brain that are actually dark. In people with really hard depression, recurrent depression, their brains are not lighting up. And that's why things that are so wonderful, like, deep brain stimulation is really going to get some followers, because it doesn't require you to be on medication that can change your life forever and have all these side effects. And they can do it safely and stimulate those parts of the brain that are affected by those particular illnesses. So I'm very excited about it. I think it's going to come a long way. Yeah, hi.
There are 2 really good articles that just came out, one in Scientific America that talked about neuroplasticity
Yeah.
and the rewiring and pruning that young people do to rewire their brain.
Right.
And how that can be. And then the second was in Discovery, and it talks about infant trauma and the research that's being done about that and what it does to the chemicals and the what it does to our brain and how it develops.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Every week, just because this topic is so fascinating to me, there's just a little more piece to the puzzle. And that study on schizophrenia of actually understanding that now it's what they know is that the brain kind of overdoes the pruning job. Our brains send a signal to prune out some of the unneeded cells, but in schizophrenia, what happens is this pruning mechanism gets turned on like 1,000 times faster than it needs to be and more aggressive. And so the closer we get to being able to fund these in the same way that we fund every other kind of illness, the sooner we're going to be able to make inroads and have a cure. I know that some of you wanted me to sign your book, and I do have books for sale if you want to. I am totally happy to continue to answer questions, but it's almost 8 o'clock. Is that how long we're going, Nancy? Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, I can go all night talking about this, so. Is there any other questions? Thank you so much. If you have it in your heart and you're interested in supporting a local organization that really helps families, your local NAMI in Clackamas County and in Multnomah County do such a wonderful job for families that are in crisis. They could use your donations. And the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care could use people who are really good at looking at these things from 300 degrees above. So thank you again for coming tonight. It was a really interesting topic. Yeah.